Hello everyone, I hope you all enjoyed your lunch. We are running a bit over. We'll try not to cut too much into your tea break. So technology is something that has come up a few times in this conference. And for that reason, we've decided to do a panel entitled Imagination and Action, Combating the Machine. What is the machine? I think when we think of technology, and particularly the word machine, we do imagine something, well, mechanistic, something that is hierarchical, something that is evoking the mass production of the technologies of the late 20th century. We think of the Fordist factory. We think of this particular model of technology which was imposing and rigid. And I think that the technology of the 21st century is something that's maybe deceptively much more fluid and democratic. You know, we've gone from having this kind of mass industrial technology to the personal computer, social media, which is really a different kind of technology in lots of ways. It in some ways is the equivalent of what Zygmunt Bauman called the tradition from a solid modernity to a more liquid modernity, and in that sense is much more anarchic and irrational than technologies of the previous century, which poses its own kinds of civilizational problem. I have here, talking on this issue today, James Noyes, who is, as well as organising this conference in quite a major way, a senior fellow of the Social Market Foundation, the author of a number of think tank reports, including work on soft power, addiction and tech regulation. James has also written a book on the destruction of cultural heritage and its relationship to state formation called The Politics of Iconoclasm. We then have Tara Isabella Burton, who is the author of several books, including Strange Rites, New Religions for a Godless World, and Self-Made, Creating Our Identities from Da Vinci to the Kardashians. She's also a visiting fellow at the George Mason University's Mercatus Center and visiting research fellow and lecturer to the Catholic University of America. We then have Alison, who, until retiring just this year, was Associate Professor in the Department of Theology and Religious Studies at Nottingham. Has also written a... Full professor, sorry. I don't know why I got so... I'm so sorry, Alison. She's going to be my mother-in-law soon, and I don't even know this. Well, yeah. And is herself an Anglican priest and canon theologian at Southwell Minster. Finally, we have the eminent Paul Kingsnorth, who is the author of 9 books of fiction, non-fiction and poetry, including the Man Booker Prize long-listed novel The Wake, and also Real England, which I know many people in this room love, and was also former deputy editor of Ecologist magazine, co-founder of the Dark Mountain Project, an international network of writers and artists. James Noyes, would you like to commence?
Thank you, Esmé. I've been asked to make this talk not too gloomy. And to the person who made that request, they risk being sorely disappointed. I also really needed a coffee, and there was no coffee outside. The machine's broken, but the very... The very lovely Mark went and found me an espresso, so the good news is that this talk is going to be less bad-tempered than it would have otherwise been. So the title of this panel is Imagination and Action, Combating the Machine. I come from the world of think tanks, so very much the world of action, or inaction, some might say, and I'll be talking today from that perspective, while hoping that what I say might also raise some interesting questions about the role of imagination in policymaking. In October, I was in Rome at a conference of regulators from around the world talking about the kind of action that might be taken when it comes to the existence of artificial intelligence in our everyday lives. I took some notes that I want to share with you today. They left me quite disheartened. Remember, these are statements by global regulators. One of them is actually from a UK government official, I won't say which. Banning things won't help anyone. And you can't regulate a technology. We need to make sure that AI doesn't outpace regulation. The technology isn't the problem. AI is just a machine. The important thing is the data fed into the machine. Garbage in, garbage out. I left Rome disheartened because in that room of pretty influential people, what struck me was not just their lack of imagination, but also their defeatism. There was some mention of the ethics of AI, but it was superficial stuff given in the context of risk, mitigation, safeguarding, and regulatory compliance. Someone briefly mentioned Isaac Asimov's 3 laws of robotics, but again, the discussion did not go beyond the idea of safeguarding, that robots can be left alone as long as they have a kill switch, and that human agency in flicking that switch always prevails. We in this room know that artificial intelligence changes those laws of robotics, that there is no kill switch the moment the machine becomes untethered from human operation and gains autonomy and agency in its own right. And yet none of the officials in that conference in Rome talked about it. Instead, there was an unspoken acceptance of a sort of Whig history of the machine, that the story of the machine can only ever move forward, never back. And the best we can do is try and keep pace with its progress and ensure that the kill switch remains just about within reach. Artificial intelligence establishes values based on 2 things, the exploitation and the exploration of data. This machine learning is achieved through reward functions and reinforcement. It is considered by its proponents to be an inherently utilitarian process. And because machines are inherently utilitarian in the way they establish value, there is the belief among these proponents of the Whig history of machines that these values are inherently good. When coupled with the belief that machines can only ever move forward, then moving forward becomes associated with the good. Progress, or as the regulators in Rome would have called it, innovation, becomes an end in itself. The machine is no longer a means. It is the end. It will take us to the end of history. This is the essentially liberal, utilitarian framework of the policy debate around machine creation, innovation, proliferation, and regulation. No wonder the regulators in that room in Rome did not dare dig too deeply into such things. For what government official or bureaucrat is going to have the guts to stand up and put forward a post-liberal discourse that seems to argue against progress, against utility, against the good? And so a consensus takes hold. Government white papers are published that promote self-regulation, innovation, and economic growth, while pushing any difficult questions out to consultation and committee inquiries. Look at the announcements made recently by the UK government. Britain needs to run towards the opportunities offered by AI, Keir Starmer has said. A new regulatory innovation office has been set up to cut red tape. The government has just opened a new AI campus in London, supported by the Google AI company DeepMind. And speaking of Google, the government also recently held an international investment summit at which Google's former chief executive, Eric Schmidt, argued for deregulation, saying, democracies, especially as old as this one, have so many ways in which people can say no, with Starmer replying that he would rip up bureaucracy to make sure that every regulator in the country takes growth as seriously as business. We know that Eric Schmidt is not oblivious to the risks of this deregulatory approach. He's written a book with Henry Kissinger precisely about those risks, and has said that advanced artificial intelligence poses an existential risk to humanity. But at the same time, these risks are presented as something as a sort of fait accompli, something to be mitigated, with Schmidt recently saying these AI systems are going to be very smart, we're going to have to coexist. Elsewhere, Schmidt has suggested that it's not just a question of coexistence, but something more profound, a coming together of human minds and machines, saying, I think this technology will ultimately be one of the greatest forces for good in mankind's history because it makes people smarter. Rather than diminishing the human, the machine can only enhance it. Our brains, our minds, our consciousness can only be improved by the machine, and in fact needs to be improved if we're to get ourselves out of the mess we currently find ourselves in. Climate change, food shortage, water shortage, disease, even death, all this can be answered by AI. Humanity is saved by the machine. These are the roots of the transhumanism, which informs much of the tech, libertarian, utilitarian, utopian mindset. Elon Musk embodies it. His companies include Neuralink, pioneering brain implant technology to achieve symbiosis between the brain and artificial intelligence, and SpaceX, pioneering heavy lift launch vehicles with an aim to establish a human colony on Mars. Enhanced brains, symbiotic with the machine, enabling a multi-planetary future. The title of this panel talks of imagination and action, but this is not just imagination. It is action happening right now, funded by the richest man in the world, who is one of the most important allies of the president of the most powerful country in the world. I don't want to push this too far, but you can see where I'm going. And most of you will be familiar with the theory whereby the transhuman, enhanced in its cognitive functions, symbiotic with the machine, and multiplanetary in its reach, begins to exceed to such an extent what it means to be human as we currently understand it, that our future selves become as different to us sitting here today as we currently are from orangutans and chimpanzees, that it is a process of evolution, of perfection, and the next stage in that process is the rise of a new species, the post-human. I told you this is going to be gloomy. So what should policymakers and regulators do? Think back to that UK government official in Rome saying to me, we need to make sure that AI doesn't outpace regulation. It sounds so shallow and laughable now, doesn't it? Of course, there have been serious attempts at thinking how governments might have a role in this. In the US, the outgoing chairman of the Federal Trade Commission, Lina Khan, took a robust approach to big tech regulation, including AI companies. The OECD has done work on AI ethics, and the EU has put forward legislation, and the UK has established a national strategy. Yet even these worthy interventions ultimately dodge the difficult questions. They lean back on the well-worn narrative of regulatory balance between opportunities and risks, but then leave the question of how that balance is achieved for someone else to answer. Take the UK's policy paper, published a couple of years ago, for example, which rather meekly said that the answer to these questions will ultimately rely on actions by governments, regulators, technical standards bodies, and industries. What does that mean? So much of it is vague, and legislative change moves so slowly. Meanwhile, I have the words of Eric Schmidt at the back of my mind when he described a 9 times gap between government and business. High tech, he said, runs 3 times faster than normal business, and the government runs 3 times slower than normal business. So we have a 9 times gap. And what also sticks in the back of my mind is an op-ed Schmidt wrote for the Wall Street Journal on the development of new drone swarm technology that uses AI on battlefield targets in conflict zones like Ukraine. Swarming means that the drones can communicate with each other in order to coordinate and collaborate without the need for human operation. Lethal autonomous weapons are the future, Schmidt has said in a piece for Foreign Affairs, and points to the fact that the Chinese military has already created an AI commander that has supreme authority in large-scale virtual war games. Every single regulatory red line is being crossed in these conditions. Now, of course, war always accelerates innovation. Longbows, rifles, tanks are examples of that. But autonomous weapons are not longbows. The pace of innovation now is like nothing we've ever seen. We can no longer talk of a 9 times gap between tech and regulators. It's becoming more of a 900 times gap, and it's getting bigger every year. So some final thoughts. What does this mean for post-liberals? The old question of how to balance regulation and innovation is becoming increasingly redundant. And I'm very frustrated when I speak to government that they keep this narrative going. We need policymakers to have the imagination, the courage, and the support to think beyond mere technocracy and crisis management. Much of the work currently being done is taken up by very technical questions of managing data privacy, risk mitigation, misinformation on social media, and facial recognition. And of course, these questions are essential, but more work needs to be done at the level of ideas to think about the human in policymaking, not just in terms of human capital or human rights, but the fully human, the truly human, the imperfectly human as non-machine. No regulator or white paper in the world is going to be enough to do that. There needs to be a cultural and a social response from within. This begins with individuals and communities. We need acts of rebellion at every level of our individual and our social lives, starting, as Claire Ainsley said yesterday, from the bottom up. There has to be a recognition also, as John Crudder said yesterday, referring to the words of the Connecticut Senator Chris Murphy, that this is a moment of moral, even spiritual importance. People cannot just wait for the state to solve the problem, nor should the state wait for the people. There has to be a collective moving forward with urgency. There has to be a new settlement. Institutions of civil society, research, and politics need to be populated and renewed by people who are prepared to think deeply about the value of personhood. We all know this requires bravery in politics, in policymaking, in academia. A status quo prevails, and those who dare to dissent are often silenced or are hounded out. But if, as our speakers were saying yesterday, we're at a moment where the ideological slate has been wiped clean, then our institutions must also reflect that. We need something akin to a post-liberal Bretton Woods or a Mount Pelerin society. Perhaps this conference is the beginning of that. As well as renewing institutions, we also need a reminder of taboos. Comparisons have often been made between the challenge of regulating AI and the work done on nuclear non-proliferation during the Cold War. But non-proliferation was not just a matter of managing weapons manufacturing. It was also about recognizing a taboo, that the creation of these weapons was an aberration in the first place, and therefore everything should be done to prevent their use. That taboo crossed international and cultural boundaries and, albeit imperfectly, brought nations together around a shared moral purpose. And I was speaking over lunch with someone about this. It's quite striking that Vladimir Putin, despite all his barking and all his threats, still hasn't pressed the red button when he promised to do a couple of years ago. That taboo is still maintained, just about. We're witnessing today a change to the world order. The 20th century saw almost the final victory of the old order, that of liberalism, until liberalism extinguished itself. Now we're witnessing it being replaced by the rise of a new order, of libertarian, utilitarian plutocrats like Elon Musk, who have almost unlimited technology and money on their side. If they prevail, this new class of plutocrats risks being replaced by something much darker and more apocalyptic, the rise and the final victory of the machine hybrids that they have created, the final victory of the post-human. So it comes down to this, echoing the words of Susanna Black-Roberts this morning. Ultimately, the fight of post-liberalism is the fight against post-humanism. It is the fight for a human future. Thank you.
Sorry, I can't. It was three ways. I think that's me. Alison, would you like to? It's okay.
It's all right, I don't need that. I feel like a very small hobbit after that description of Mordor. And and I think what I'm going to say, in some ways, is going to sound ridiculous after what has been described. But I have hope that what I say is not as ridiculous as first appears. So I'm going to begin with a quotation. Instead of functioning actively as an autonomous personality, man will become a passive, purposeless, machine-conditioned animal whose proper functions as technicians now interpret man's role will either be fed into the machine or strictly limited and controlled for the benefit of depersonalized collective organizations. And those words were long before AI. So Lewis Mumford's History of Technology describes life at the service of the machine, about which Paul Kingsnorth has said so much. And this, of course, chimes with my experience as an academic. We heard a lot about that from academics yesterday, and as an Anglican priest dealing with the bureaucracy of the Church of England. No doubt it resonates with your own work experience. So how can we challenge the machine? How can we restore to public discourse the idea of the good life as that which should direct our institutions? So, unsurprisingly, as a literary critic, I'm going to argue for the importance of imagination in this task, which may seem an impractical base for practical action, or radical action, yet this is far from the case. After all, politics, like the nation in Benedict Anderson's celebrated phrase, is an imagined community. Imagination is as necessary to write a manifesto or provide a hypothesis for a scientific experiment as it is to make a garden. For Mumford, managerial technology downgrades human creativity and agencies. So in universities, we older academics may grumble, but our younger colleagues accept willingly purposeless tasks as valid because they have never known anything different. Indeed, the reason why we need the imagination to change our politics is it's the only way to enable us to conceive some different way of organizing society, of organizing AI. Yet our education makes this ever harder. The decline of learning languages means people no longer understand reality from a different linguistic or cultural perspective. The reduction of so much literary study to a few emancipatory feminist or post-colonial gestures means that students look only for tropes that confirm their own experience. The unnuanced understanding of the past as mostly wicked, apart from a few proto-modern eruptions, see Hilary Mantel, means we lack the ability to conceive of historical difference as having any value. Without the distancing imagination, we are slaves of our own systems. Though my remarks may sound reactionary, I'm not advocating a return to some supposedly pre-modern Eden, but ways to an alternative future. The capacity to entertain the possibility of virtue in markets, for example, or how our health service might involve duties as well as services, rely on acts of imagination. Owen Barfield wrote lyrically of what he called original participation in traditional cultures in which all natural forms were alive and full of presence. Modern Western culture has long lost this vision in our rationalism and disenchantment. And yet there is gain in our loss and alienation, according to Barfield. For now, as the poet W.H. Auden puts it, we can learn to love knowing we love. Our self-conscious sense of distance from nature enables us to understand its otherness and that our own imagination helps to create the world that we see and know. It empowers us and it empowers nature. The word love used by Auden suggests that all knowing is communion. To know is to share actively in that one knows. If we are to be liberated from the machine, it will never happen through the autonomous liberal subject. This is, as feminist critics point out, a fiction which denies the relationships which sustain the person. And as a false ideal, it is all too easily manipulable by the machine. Moreover, the privileging of choice as a telos or aim has no real object or substantive good. Such an anthropology has left us with a politics without vision, a populism without solidarity, and economics devoid of value. Here's a description of a different anthropology from Mumford. Wherever the seasons are marked by holiday festivals, where the stages of life are punctuated by family and communal rituals, where work, even hard work, is rarely divorced from rhythm, song, human companionship, and aesthetic delight, where vital activity is counted as greater reward of labour as the product, where neither power nor profit takes precedence of life, where the family and the neighbour and the friend are all part of a visible, tangible, face-to-face community, where everyone can perform as man or woman any task anyone is qualified to do. Sounds great, doesn't it? He continues, there the Neolithic culture, in its essentials, is still in existence. Mumford points out this is how most people lived over human history. This model had durability because it did justice to natural conditions and human capabilities. We are distant from the Neolithic, but that very difference acts as critique and shows us what we have lost. Holistic work, a holistic life, work with its own intrinsic value, human interdependence, meaning. And Mumford suggests elements of the Neolithic are still possible within a world of stuttering trucks, as he puts it, when machines are embedded in social processes. When we give to AI, for example, different criteria upon which to work. Can we not imagine that? Imaginative distance then can drive our desires and our policies. Put the Neolithic model next to a housing plan and imagine how that might affect it. How will it aid communal life, develop relationships with nature? How can its construction be a meaningful activity for the workers? How can its layout make room for ceremonies? These questions assume we are interdependent relational beings who put value into every step of a project, not just its end point. And by this imaginative distanciation, we can move beyond that Neolithic localism, which again, on its own, is not enough, to move out from what Burke called the subordinate partiality of the family and locality, step by step to connect with larger structures. However, in contradiction to John Lennon's song Imagine, which wants to lose religion, we need the sacred. Why? Because we need an invisible good that stands over against us and holds our politics to account, to ground the common good. There has to be a transcendent good to offer a satisfactory telos to direct our decision-making, so that it does not get captured by second-order aims like reputation or efficiency, as James was suggesting in his description of AI regulation. We mustn't lose that sense of an imaginative conception that can only be reached by practices that already embody it, which is teleological. Imagination is not fantasy, but participates in the good. Coleridge said, in God himself. For him, it was an echo of the divine creativity. Combating the machine, then, must begin, as in Plato's Republic, with education. Education of the imagination, at home, at school, in our work, as a mode of distanciation and critique, of making everything strange, and learning to recover thereby the common good, so that we can wake up one morning and realize with John Ruskin that there is no wealth but life. Thank you.
I do have a machine, but it's one of those e-ink ones. It's not addictive. It's a good machine. It's a remarkable. I think the original title of this panel was AI, Technology, and Magic. And I'm excited to talk about magic. It's my favorite thing to talk about. So that's where I'll begin. So I'm sure that we're all familiar. Machine is broken. We're all familiar with the famous Arthur C. Clarke maxim that all good technology is indistinguishable from magic. But today I want to talk about one very particular form of technology and why it's particularly indistinguishable from, and maybe even in fact, synonymous with magic itself. And that technology is, to put it sort of, there's really no way to make this shorter, the contemporary platform-driven internet of the modern attention economy. Call it the desire digital carnival. I would, if someone else has a great, short, pithy name for it, I'd love to hear it. But no longer the virtual Wild West of the early internet era, where anyone and everyone could seek out information and community with anarchic alacrity, but rather the siloed world of social media platforms, our primary method of interfacing with this vast digital world, and the algorithms that serve us up content in accordance with our ostensible preferences and desires, then track and commodify our desires in turn, our desire to click, even if it's a hate click, to pay attention, to like, to share, to be liked, to be shared. As some of you already know, I'm currently working on a book about magic, by which I mean not illusions or stage magic or even new age or witchcraft or wellness culture, but rather what some scholars have called the Western esoteric tradition. A religious as well as, I'd argue, technological sensibility that I believe arose out of the Renaissance revival of Neoplatonism, and in particular, Hermeticism, a heavily Neoplatonic influenced mystery tradition that I at least date to late antique Alexandria, where proto-Orthodox Christianity, Gnosticism, and this Hermeticism flourished and developed side by side and in dialogue with one another. This sensibility, reintroduced into the Latin-speaking West at the court of Cosimo de' Medici in 15th century Florence, doubled as a kind of religious philosophy of technology, one which centered the divinization of the self through scientific and spiritual gnosis. Understand the world out there, understand the world in here, and you too, if you are a Hermetic mage, can ascend to a godlike status, to even become not just like God, but perhaps God himself, depending on how you read the Corpus Hermeticum. And by having in this Hermetic worldview a correct understanding of the proper connections and correspondences between all levels of reality, reality that emanated from a rather Neoplatonic influenced conception of the one, meant that man, or at least the knowing mage, the right sort of man, could harness that knowledge, making use of this noetic realm in order to become a noetic realm that is closer to God, that is even realer than material reality, in order to influence his life and fate. An example of someone who takes this up in the Renaissance era is Marsilio Ficino, for example, who is not just a translator of Plato at the court of Cosimo de' Medici, but also a translator, the first translator into the Latin West in that time of the Corpus Hermeticum, who takes some of these ideas to, in his book on life, try and figure out a kind of semi-magical, semi-self-help way of transcending the influences of the stars. So according to his cosmology, the stars are influencing his temperament, his destiny in particular ways, but through the right use of certain kinds of ritual involving correspondences of the universe, he can bypass the stars, essentially. He can sort of ask to speak to a divine manager and go over the head of the stars and have a particular influence on his own fate. So this idea that sort of divine transhumanism, that to become godlike through a knowledge of both a sort of scientific knowledge, through technological ability, you find this, for example, in the alchemical tradition, but also through a kind of self-knowledge, a knowledge of access to and control over desire, particularly, although not exclusively limited to, erotic desire. In the Renaissance, sort of all the way through various iterations of this esoteric tradition. I won't get into all the details because for time, but until the present day, there's this sense that the magician is one who is able to harness this invisible energy of desire, his own, other people's, if he'd like to make other people do his bidding, in order to essentially become more divine, become post-human, and get what he wants. So why am I talking about Renaissance magic in a talk about technology? And the reason is I see this sort of digital carnival of the internet as in many ways making literal the cosmology of the magician. Whatever is actually true in the world that we're all in right now, this is very much the implicit law of how the internet operates. If you want to see something once, if you express your desire in terms of liking or clicking something, you are going to be served up more of the same. If you want to read or be involved with a certain vision of truth because you have a particular political preference or a particular bias, those are the headlines that are going to show up in your social media feed. The world around you that you are plugged into quite literally shifts in real time in accordance with your desires. Now, again, something else I do not have time to get into today is that there is, in fact, a bit of a sort of historical, concrete connection here. Many of the architects of what we might now consider the network computing through the modern internet were influenced by a sort of long tradition of countercultural, the sort of the 60s, 70s counterculture is in turn influenced by a lot of esoteric thought, by this religious sensibility, but that's a story for another time. Today, I want to think about what it actually means to be plugged into, to spend our time in a world where these magical visions of the self are, if not cosmically true, then at least functionally true. What does it prime us to think? What does it prime us to expect? And I have many reservations about smartphone culture, about the digital carnival, about social media. But the strongest one that I have is, in fact, the sort of profoundly anti-human way that it encourages us to think in these magical terms about desire, about ourselves, and about a reality that is downstream of desire, that what we want makes us who we are, that by looking inward, by accessing our thoughts, our emotions, our desires, everything else will just fall into place. And for me, one of the most striking examples of the fact that there is a sort of this magical theology, this implicitly esoteric theology underpins our use of the internet, is in fact the rise of belief among young people in particular in what is known as manifesting. So quick show of hands, who's heard of manifesting? Great, I don't have to explain at length. Who's practiced it? Oh, wow, that is the lowest I have gotten. I do this in college classes all the time, and it's usually like 50-50. So, but yeah, so this idea, now 50% of Americans say they believe in manifesting. 20% say they've tried it. So I don't have British numbers. It's only really been one study, so I don't actually know how this breaks down by age. I will say again, anecdotally in college classes, it seems like a lot more than 20%. But there is, for those 5 of you who don't know what it is, it's this very wedded to 19th century New Thought, a sort of an American spiritualistic self-help tradition that basically says what you want is reality, that if you focus hard enough on what you want, you're able to tap into the energy, the fun, sort of electric undercurrent of the universe and harness that in order to bring into effect your desire. It started out in the 19th century largely as a faith healing phenomenon. It was for health. Later in the 19th century and early 20th century, in the Gilded Age in America, it became very wedded to wealth, the idea that you could think and grow rich, to name one very famous self-help book in this vein. Actually had a resurgence in the 50s under Norman Vincent Peale. One might say a double resurgence. A fun fact for those of you who don't know, Donald Trump did in fact attend Norman Vincent Peale's church, Marble Collegiate, and cited him as an influence. So if you do want to draw a lineage of at least the New Thought portion of this magical tradition, it's worth doing. But I think whatever we think about, let's say, that one particular example, the broader sense that manifesting is not just possible but real, but how the universe works, is becoming something that is culturally normalized. And to an extent, again, in the digital carnival, that is true. Someone who has the right command of the right memes at the right time, who is able to basically go viral, is able to shape not just public perceptions, but the kind of economic and political realities that in a democracy tend to be downstream of public perception. I think I'm not sure how many of you are already familiar with this. Back in 2016, there was a brief flowering of interest in what was known as meme magic. Again, quick show of hands, who's heard of this? Okay, I'll try and explain it basically, a bunch of people on the alt-right on message boards thought that they had used magic to get Donald Trump elected. It's much more complicated than that, and if I had more time, I would explain it. But the long and the short of it was this sense that there was a kind of political energy in the will of the people of the United States that could be harnessed in part by being able to sort of post charged sigils on social media platforms. Now, it's easy to say that's very ridiculous. However, there's another school of thought, and the scholar Gary Lockman has written really convincingly on this, that what you are doing when you are sharing a meme that goes viral is you are imbuing a sign with certain kinds of power that gets into other people's cognition and desire and shapes how they act. And certainly within the esoteric tradition, that is how magic works. That is as much how Giordano Bruno writes in the 15th century about binding people as it is about, let's say, Aleister Crowley in the early 20th century and these sort of online meme magicians of 2016. So what I'm not saying is the internet is full of demons and it's magical and bad and we should get rid of it. I'm not saying that, but I'm not saying that. But what I do want to then drive home is this world that we're living in, that we're participating in for however long we are participating in it, be whatever portion of our days, go home, look at your screen time tracker. You can answer that question for yourself. That world has a metaphysical architecture. It has theological assumptions built into it. And the time that we spend in a world where those things are true does in fact reshape and condition us. It conditions us to expect instant results. It conditions us to expect that our desires be made manifest. But importantly, it also conditions us to expect that this be done, as the New Yorker writer Kyle Chaika has said, frictionlessly. That we don't just get what we want. We aren't just sub-creators, making the world into, saying abracadabra and the world exists around us. We are somehow relieved of the burden and the desire to create things that require self-giving, that require time, that require attention, that require difficulty, that require actual craftsmanship. And I think the internet has its place, it has its time. I don't think getting rid of it in any kind of macro way is the answer, mostly. But I do think that we need to be hyper-cognizant, not just of individual effects of bad things that might happen because of social media, be it the rise of eating disorders in young women, be it the proliferation of violent pornography and what that means for gender relations, be it anything else you name. We need to, I think, have a philosophy of how to combat what the digital carnival makes us into as human beings. How do we resist this? I will say I'm not sure. I think that there are legislative answers, some of which have already come up. One particular set of policies that I'm personally committed to is making public space as non-smartphone dependent as possible, which is to say, I live in New York City, and I don't have a smartphone back when I'm home. I only have it when traveling, and I will say, generally, this is doable. There is public transit, for example. Streets are numbered, very helpful. But more broadly, I am even conscious, even there, of how many, and this is particularly post-pandemic, how many social interactions or economic interactions require smartphone access. You need a QR code to look at a menu, and they will refuse to give you a paper menu. Physical maps have vanished from bike sharing stations in favor of advertisements. So if you are out, without a phone, you cannot look at a map. These expectations are built into the architecture of cities. And I was reminded, I believe that when Notre Dame reopened just a couple of days ago, there was actually a huge outcry because if you basically could not go if you did not have a smartphone. The only ticketing they were taking was QR codes. So I think there's sort of three categories. One is big picture legislation about technology itself. One is, let's say, positive or I think in terms of cities, urbanist, but also more broadly geographic. What kind of policies can we put into place to make our landscapes less reliant on them, to make them more accessible for people who either cannot afford a smartphone, who might not be able to use a smartphone, or who just plain do not want to be plugged into a device 24/7. And finally, philosophically, how do we think about combating what I think of as a deeply religious, or at least a deeply theologically loaded and wicked sensibility about what it means to be human. So I look forward to all of you telling me what to do on all 3 points very shortly. Thank you.
Rest assured, we will extend the tea break. You will have a tea break. Don't worry about that. What would you like to do?
The machine appeared in the distance, singing to itself of money. Its song was the web they were caught in, men and women together. The villages were as flies to be sucked empty. God secreted a tear. Enough, enough, he commanded. But the machine looked at him and went on singing. I might just sit down now. But it's a part of a poem by R.S. Thomas, a very grumpy Welsh clergyman and wonderful poet who wrote decades ago about what the machine was. And since we're here talking about it, and since everybody's said, really, I haven't got much to add to what they've said, we should think about what we're talking about when we talk about this machine. And I'll just offer you some thoughts here. What do we actually mean? Now, what Thomas meant was a force which was opposed to God, which sang to us and would not stop singing. A force that was made of money and power. And so many of the poets and so many of the novelists and so many of the filmmakers and so many of the science fiction writers for the last 100 years have been writing about the machine. Everything from Metropolis to The Matrix has been about the machine. Mary Shelley was writing about the machine. George Orwell and Aldous Huxley were writing about the machine. D.H. Lawrence wrote endlessly about the machine. The triumph of the machine, he talked of. The triumph of the machine being the destruction of the earth and the destruction of the machine in the process. Wonderful Lawrence poem. But what is this thing? What are we talking about? Well, Alison has quoted Lewis Mumford. It's very difficult to talk about the machine without quoting Lewis Mumford. His great book, The Myth of the Machine, which was published in the 60s, was completely prophetic about what's actually happening and where we are. So he says this, I'll just quote Mumford again if you don't mind. The last century, we all realize, has witnessed a radical transformation in the entire human environment, largely as a result of the impact of the mathematical and physical sciences on technology. Never since the Pyramid Age have such vast physical changes been consummated in such a short time. All these changes have in turn produced alterations in the human personality, while still more radical transformations, if this process continues, unabated and uncorrected, loom ahead. Now, Mumford is writing that 60 years ago, and the process did continue unabated and uncorrected. And we've seen the more radical transformations in human nature itself that have been caused by this radical change in landscape and technology. And Mumford continues with this new megatechnics. The dominant minority will create a uniform, all-enveloping, superplanetary structure designed for automatic operation. And man, as a purposeless, machine-conditioned animal, will be either fed into the machine or strictly limited and controlled for the benefit of depersonalized collective organizations. Now that sounds like a pretty good description of the 2020s, I would say. The depersonalized collective organizations that Mumford is talking about are the giant transnational corporations which now control most of our lives. They produce the food we eat and the clothes we wear and the technology we use and the entertainment we consume, because that's what we do now, don't we? We consume entertainment, and the news we base our opinions upon, all the while employing millions of us as laborers and harvesting us as products ourselves through the detailed personal information we freely volunteer them daily all over the internet. And these corporations are facilitated by equally depersonalized states, which exist not to promote the interests of their citizens, despite what they pretend largely, but to service the corporations and provide for their interests, a process known as economic growth. And this growth is the overriding purpose of the global economy which the machine has built. Everything else is of secondary concern. The growth has, at this point, no specific aim in sight and no end in sight, and can always be justified by pointing to problems like poverty or environmental degradation, which in many cases were caused by the growth, but which can now only be solved by more of the growth. And the growth is facilitated by the production and consumption of goods and services, the desire or need for which has been manufactured by huge marketing and advertising concerns whose best minds are trained in the essence of psychological manipulation. The rise and triumph of the internet, which is the neurological network of the machine, has meant that there are now few places on earth that we can escape from the incessant noise of this state corporate growth and the incessant urge to contribute to it by clicking, scrolling, buying and competing. It's prescribed all of our values, it's proscribed the alternatives, and it shows no sign of stopping. And it can't stop, for to do so would mean collapse. It's like a shark. If it stops swimming, it dies. That may be an urban myth about sharks, but it's a good image anyway. Any shark experts in the audience can take me up on it later. Growth has become an end in itself, long divorced from any means. And as the great wilderness writer Edward Abbey once put it, growth for the sake of growth is the ideology of the cancer cell. So that's the machine. And the machine is not simply the sum total of all the individual technologies that we've managed to cleverly make, like cars or laptops or robot lawnmowers. These things Lewis Mumford calls technics. The technics are the product of the machine. They're not the machine itself. The machine is actually a tendency within us. And it's made concrete by power and circumstance, and it coalesces in this huge planetary agglomeration of power and control and ambition. And the progress of this machine, as all the poets showed us, and all the filmmakers showed us, and all the novelists showed us, always raises and destroys and transmutes the less measurable things. If the machine can't measure it, it's not real. So all of the things that post-liberals care about, even though they might not necessarily have the language to describe or defend it, all the older things perhaps, the rooted human communities, the wild nature, the human nature, human freedom, beauty and faith, and the deeper values that actually make a human life worth living, those things cannot be measured. And they will always be rolled over by the machine because they don't create profit. They don't add anything to the mix. And the modus operandi of this machine, the thing that it does fundamentally to our cultures, is the thing that people here have been talking about for 2 days, which is it destroys borders, boundaries, categories, essences, and truths. And it uproots all the previous ways of living in the name of individualism and subjectivity, and its end game, intentionally or otherwise, is the replacement of nature with technology in order to facilitate total human control over a totally human world. Now, what that control looks like, you can see if you listen to the philosophers of Silicon Valley, the people who are actually creating the tech that we're using. And when you listen to these people, some of them are pretty naked about what they're doing, theologically naked about what they're doing. So transhumanist Martine Rothblatt, by the way, who has created a new religion, trans religion it's called, Terasem. Terasem is a religion for the post-human world. She says that by building AI systems, we are making God. And transhumanist Elise Bohan says we are building God. Kevin Kelly, great philosopher of the Technium, you should read his book, What Technology Wants. It's very good. I completely disagree with it, but it's very good. Really, really good explanation of what this thing is. And he sees technology as a force with its own momentum, its own teleology, its own structure. He says anyone who believes that technologies are neutral is a fool. That's not what's going on. Now, I agree with him. We agree for different reasons, but it's a very good book you should read. Kevin Kelly says we can see more of God in a cell phone than in a tree frog. And when you ask Google maven Ray Kurzweil, who's currently Google's head of engineering, I believe, does God exist? He replies, not yet. Not yet. So these people are not just trying to steal fire from the gods, they're trying to build the gods or to replace the gods. And AI is the way that this is happening at present. And it's very interesting, by the way, to see how AI has infiltrated religion. Wonderful story that I'm sure some of you saw that came out last week from Switzerland. AI Jesus. Anyone see AI Jesus? parish church in Switzerland introduced an experimental art installation into the confessional, in which people can interact with an AI program meant to imitate Christ. It's trained in scripture and theological text taken from the internet, leaving open the possibility that it could offer biblical interpretations or spiritual advice at odds with church teaching. What do you think the chances of that are? Fortunately, according to its creator, in all previous tests, his answers have matched the theological view of St. Peter's Church. So that's all right then. We're okay for now. AI Jesus is behaving. There are some other good examples. There's a Catholic church in Warsaw, Poland, which has an AI robot in it called Santo. And Santo looks like a statue of a saint and is designed to help people pray by offering Bible quotes in response to questions. Even better, this is my favourite, there's a Protestant church in Germany which has a robot called Bless You Too. And Bless You Too looks a bit like a character designed by Aardman Animations. Bless You Too can forgive your sins in 5 different languages. Which is good. Which is very handy if they're too embarrassing to confess to the priest. You can just talk to Bless You Too. So this is all good and entertaining, but it's also an example of how confused some religious authorities apparently are about what's going on. Because they believe, as we've just heard, that these things are just tools, that they don't have their own teleology, they don't have their own direction, they're not going anywhere. To quote James, maybe they subscribe to the Whig theory of technology or the Whig theology of technology. But I think the machine is a different thing. I think it has its own theology. I agree with Kevin Kelly, actually, although we would have a very different view on why. The machine is moving in a direction. It's not just a bunch of technologies that we've cleverly made. It's moving somewhere. Under its own steam, it has its own theology, and it challenges our notions of what it means to be human. We've heard plenty about this already, much better than I could put it, but this theology, it's important to understand what it is. It's not new. First time we heard this theology was in the Garden of Eden, when the serpent promised Adam and Eve that by disobeying God, they shall become as gods, knowing good and evil. In this old story, you've got this primal choice. You can obey the Creator and live in communion with creation, or you can follow the tempting snake around the tree. You can become as gods. You follow your own will instead. Perhaps this is at the root of what Tara's talking about, manifesting. Maybe this is the first example. The serpent says, follow your own desires and not those of the Creator of the world. The serpent says what Aleister Crowley said, actually. Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law, which is also a good summary of what the world is turning into. So after we obey the serpent, we fall out of the Garden of Eden and all we have is technology and we start to build things. And as we do, persistently all the way through human history, actually, we try to become as gods, knowing good and evil. This is what we really want, it seems. And we've wanted it for a long time. And the direction of travel is away from the imago Dei, the imago Dei, the human made in the image of God, and towards the human made in the image of the machine, or maybe vice versa. Away from thy will be done and towards do what thou wilt. So that's where we are. I think we're in a place where we have created something that's lived within us for a long time. And all of the technologies that we can see are an external manifestation. They're the superstructure of what this thing is. And it's going somewhere. And we want it to go somewhere. And we know what the end point is. The end point is the end of death. The end point is transhumanism. The end point is artificial intelligence, the internet of bodies, the internet of things, the Elon Musk chip in your brain. The machine is an attempt to imagine a world totally transformed by humans down to the last nanoparticle. A human-centric world, not a logo-centric world, an anthropocentric world made for our use, a humanity with godlike powers, terraforming Mars, living in immortal robot bodies. It sounds mad, it sounds funny, but it's what's happening. And it's where we're going. And we're going there very quickly. So that's what the people creating this thing, and all of us are creating it every time we click and scroll, that's what they imagine is going on. And since the word imagination is in the title of the talk, we should think about what we should imagine as an alternative, because I think imagination is the key. We can talk about politics and economics, and that's all good and necessary, but actually, as much as anything else, this is a question of storytelling. It's a question of imagination, because if we're telling the wrong stories, and the wrong stories led us into this machine, then we have to start telling the right ones. And until we do that, the politics is secondary, actually. The technology is secondary. We have to tell the right stories about what it means to be a human in the world. and what technology actually is, and what creation actually should be, and what the limits on these things should be, and what God we are serving when we create. Everything you create serves something. To quote Bob Dylan, you've got to serve somebody. Who are you going to serve? You're going to serve yourself, or the serpent, or God? That's the question. So if the machine's part of us, and what's manifesting around us is its superstructure, then there's a couple of things we can do. I'll just end by suggesting what they are. There is a path of resistance, actually. You need, if you ask me, to resist the machine as much as you can by trying not to engage with it any more than you have to. I'm never going to use an AI program if I have a choice, but I probably won't have. I don't have a smartphone. I actually considered, when I was asked to give this talk, I considered copying the American neo-Luddite writer Kirkpatrick Sale, who was invited to a conference about technology in the 1990s, and he was invited to give a critique of technology in the machine, and he had a 45-minute slot, and he just put a computer on a desk, and when his time came up, he walked onto the stage with a sledgehammer, smashed it up, and just walked off. And that was all he needed to say. I would recommend taking a hammer to your smartphone, but I think it would be very polluting, but there's something else you could probably do. I don't know. Resisting this stuff, resisting engagement with this stuff is really vital. And actually what Tara said about that is crucial as well. If the public realm is created in a way that it's almost impossible not to use a smartphone, then nobody has a choice. But we still have a choice. And we can't blame anyone else for what we do. Every time you click and scroll and offer your information, the machine grows in intelligence. So disengage with it. But there's another job as well. And it's about the imagination. As I said, it's about telling stories and creating things and making things that are beautiful and are natural and serve the right God rather than the wrong one, because if you don't tell different stories, you can't turn anything around. What is a nation? A nation is a story. A culture is a story. A family is a story. Even a person, to some degree, is a story, something we believe. Our values, the stuff we've been talking about all day and all of yesterday as well. So you need to tell stories about a different world, a human-scale world, yes, built around the virtues, centered around something or someone that is higher than us, that is not about us making ourselves gods, but is actually about serving God. A world that is not built around growth, but is built around something else. I would suggest worship. Telling stories that see both humans and nature as radically different to the dead, cold, ultimately suicidal transhumanist worldview, which isn't a move towards what C.S. Lewis called the abolition of man. That's where we're going. And Lewis said the final triumph over nature will involve a triumph over human nature, and we will then have won the battle, but who actually will have won it? Who precisely will have won the battle when we have defeated both nature and human nature? We need to tell a radically different story to the one that tells us that that's a good thing. We need to manifest, to quote G.H. Lawrence again, which I always like to do, manifest what he called the inward revolt of the native creatures of the soul. That's great. The inward revolt of the native creatures of the soul against the machine. Everybody has to do this. Everybody can tell a different story. Everybody can create something beautiful. Everybody can create something that serves the right God instead of the wrong one. And I suggested until we start to do that, then everything else keeps going in this direction. Best way to resist the machine is to tell stories that it can't understand. Okay, thanks.
C.S. Lewis there. There's something also in the abolition of man that he says when technologists reinvent the world through these machines and systems, future generations become, quote, patients of their power. And I think that really touches on what you're saying. I'm going to be very conservative and just take 2 questions. Okay, definitely you were first, Ethan. Somebody please give Ethan a microphone. Thank you so much, Susanna. Ethan and... Eric, I think you were second. Great. Oh, hello.
So, as far as I've understood your talks, there seems to be this constant dichotomy of man battling against the machine. And I think you can go as far back to that with the agricultural revolution, which fundamentally changes humanity's relationship with the whole world. You go from hunter-gatherers to effectively creating civilization. And the question I've got is, it seems to me within your ways of thinking that there's never a line at which you go, the machine should be accepted in certain contexts, because it seems to me that if we adopted this mentality about the natural state of man, etc., that man would still be living in caves and hunting and gathering rather than creating all of this which is around us.
I wonder if, Paul, if you'd like to respond to that one.
Yeah, can you hear me? Humans never lived in caves, you know. This is a great myth. It's very interesting. No one ever lived in caves because they're cold and damp and horrible. But they did at least have daylight, unlike this glorious room that's been created by the machine. No, I mean, look, you're right. I think that the important thing to remember is that the machine comes from the human heart. And it certainly does go back at least to the Industrial Revolution. Actually, Mumford said that the first example of a machine society was the Pyramid Age in Egypt, because he said the society that was built there, because so many slaves were required to build these incredible things, he said that was a machine made of human parts. And it had the same desire as... He compared the building of a pyramid to the building of a space rocket, and he said both of these are built at great cost to the environment, great cost to humanity, involving an enormous amount of labour simply to send a favoured few into heaven, which I think is rather good. It's true. This thing is not possible to stop in one sense, that you couldn't really draw a line and say, let's not go any further than this. And you can't separate the machine from the people. There's a famous book called Erewhon by Samuel Butler from the 1890s, I think, where there's a revolution against technology and people decide they're going to smash all the machines built after an arbitrarily chosen date and then just stop technology there, which I think is a great plan. We could all argue about the date. Actually, that's the basis of Dune as well, but that's another story. There's been a Butlerian jihad in Dune, which is why there's no technology. The question is, how would you live? And the answer is, you're always going to be fighting against this tendency. And the trouble we have now is everything is so incredibly technologized and digitized that it's almost impossible to resist it. And it's impossible to hide from it anywhere. I don't accept the notion that there was a terrible primitive state of nature which was awful and then we progressed into the glories of modernity. I don't believe in that story. But I do think that it's very, very difficult to resist it on any societal scale. I do think that, and I've been writing about this for years and trying to work out what that actually means in terms of how people can resist and refuse it. And as I say, I think we have to change the stories before we can do anything about that. So that's my very long-winded answer. Sorry.
Thank you. Eric, would you like to?
Brilliant again from all of you. It's so rich and addressing all of the most important questions. So a friend of mine, deeply devout Catholic, his name is Johanni Steinmann, he argues very strongly that Christianity is not just a humanism, it's actually a form of transhumanism from the get-go, because its aim is theosis. He argues this quite strongly. And so he would say that we have to fight a bad transhumanism with a good transhumanism. And one could ask perhaps also with the question of magic as well. We have to fight the bad forms of magic with the imaginative, literary good forms of magic. What do you think about that? That's my question.
Tara, given that you've made the link to theology already, if you'd like to take that.
Yeah, so I think that's absolutely right. And I wish we could have all day to talk about 4th century Alexandria. But one of the things that is, I think, so fascinating to me about the assuming you're dating the Corpus Hermeticum where I'm dating it, all of these different religious questions and conversations happening centered around perhaps if there's a common thread, there's something divine about being a human being or something divine about the human. How do we understand it? How do we theorize it? And I think the magical worldview, or the magical transhumanist view, which is how I refer to it in my book, is not that different from Orthodox Christianity, or lowercase o. It's different enough that what makes it different is worth discussing on its own merits, which is to say, the idea of a loving creator God who is also the one and the source of all, a conception of original sin, or at least of a fall. And I think that these distinctions are vital too, in helping us think usefully about technology. I think I'm less down on technology than you are, Paul, overall, which is to say, I think that there are creative ways that we shape and subcreate and steward and reimagine our environment, because that is a fundamentally human thing to do. What worries me about the sort of what I'll call the digital carnival within the machine, or I don't think they're quite synonymous, but close enough, is this idea that the reification of human desire downstream of the fact that we don't have access to our own desires, our desires are very easily controlled from without. I mean, even if the hypothetical magical vision of our desires being fundamentally true and for God, which is also sort of within Orthodox Christian tradition, is true and real, it is also true that one of the things, theologically speaking, about being a sinful human is that desire is where the devil gets in. And I think my particular worry about this particular iteration of technology is not that it is technology, it's that it is so fully disembodied and so fully desired based that the creative tension that I think ordinarily makes other kinds of technology or other kinds of creation good and worthwhile is absent. I mean, if it even just in terms of a question of time, if I'm spending many years writing a novel, I am spending time of my finite life, and I am spending attention, and even that is nothing compared to someone who's actually sort of making something. I'm just telling a little story. But there is a kind of sacrifice of myself that happens in creation. There's a sacrifice that happens in any kind of craftsmanship. And I worry, which, if you're feeding something and telling AI to generate a poem, it's not there, and the sacrifice of our own selves and our own time isn't there. That isn't to say I think the washing machine is great, that everything has to be a sacrifice of time and energy. I think there is a question of degree and discernment. But I think the fact that Christianity is in some sense transhumanist should help us better understand, and I think better critique, what we see as contemporary transhumanism.
Thank you. I'll take one more. Are you at the... I don't know your name, sorry. Yeah, please.
Hi. So first of all, thank you for the lovely panel. I've been slipping back into my smartphone, and you made me throw it in my backpack. So that was very kind of you. Thank you. But so I'm very much like middle of Gen Z, and I'm really quite worried in all of this that I get this sense when I talk to people my age, like it's almost too far gone. Like they're so in it with the technology, with the internet. TikTok has really done a number on the young minds of my generation. And I guess my question is, how would you talk to a young person who their entire life from the age of 10, 11, 12 has been consumed by these social media platforms? Like, how do you get out of that? Like, it just feels like we've sort of crossed a Rubicon in recent years that, like, I'm not sure how we come back from this. So, sorry for a downer.
Would any of you particularly like to take that one?
Well, there are young people who are using technology, and the way that Lewis Mumford said you could use technology, even in the Neolithic they had technology, but it was an extension of the human body, so it kind of extended what the human could do according to a human purpose. And I know young people among my students who have used social media in order to enable relationships, friendships that would never have been possible without it, and have actually led to real human bodies meeting in real places and exchanging ideas. So that possibility is still there. We still have to have hope. Otherwise, we should just go home and have a gin and tonic. We have to have hope that we can use these things for human purpose, and that we can even use AI. I don't like it very much, and I'm not an expert on it, but I do believe that there are different ways in which we can use it. And we have to have hope about the environment, that we can, even if the temperature rises, that we can, as we learn in learning by doing, that we can imagine ways to live. And we need to use arts of all sorts, and we can use, we can make pictures like David Hockney on computers. We don't have to ignore the technology, but we can use it to extend our humanity. But can I just say something about theosis, which is that Christian theosis depends upon the fact that we're not God. We can only participate in God because we're not God. We are vulnerable humans, and it's that enables it. And so if we can somehow use all this in a vulnerable human way and building that into it, there is hope. So I beg you to have it. Sorry.
I'll just add really quickly, because that makes me think. I have teenage children myself. My daughter is nearly 17. She refuses to have a smartphone, actually. I'm very proud of her. And she's persuaded several of her friends to refuse to have them as well. And there is a movement against people, of people in your generation, to get rid of them and get dumb phones instead, which is a good idea. I'm not hopeful at all about using some of these things for good, because I don't think they're designed for good. They have a teleology and they go in a certain direction. So we're not going to use them, they're going to use us. You have to be very careful when you talk about technology, because it could mean anything. It could mean a digging stick, it could mean language, or it could mean a smartphone. And those are qualitatively different things. Humans always make things and always use technology. The question is, what thing have you made, and is it using you? So I think there's a necessity for people to move away, make a conscious decision in groups, probably with friends, to move away from certain technologies. There's a kind of technological ascesis, a technological asceticism, which I've written about a bit before, and I think it's really important. But that doesn't mean you say no to everything. You can't do that. You have to live in the world we're in. I'd like to live without the internet, but I can't. So there we go. But what relationship are you going to have with it? It's difficult to fight it on your own because you get picked off. But there are groups of people who are young doing this stuff already. And I think that if we want to talk about hope, I think the hope in the young generation is precisely because they've grown up completely soaked in this stuff. They can actually see what it's doing to them. I mean, I can see what it's doing as well, because I grew up before the internet and now it's here. But if you grow up with it rotting your mind and you see it rotting your friend's mind, then enough of you can do something about that. So I think there's a case to be made for movements of young people actually saying, right, we're not having this thing. We're not engaging with this thing. We're not going to have this phone. And just living like that and taking the consequences of it. And that stuff, I think, would inspire more people than we imagine, because so many people can see what damage it's doing. So I would start there and see what happens. I know some people are doing it already, but... So, yeah, I mean, that's where the hope is. People can change things. Fasting to some degree, yeah, but I would say there's an ascetic need to decide what technology is actually good for you and what technology is manipulating you, and whether you're actually in charge of this thing or not. That would be my suggestion. Yeah, thanks.
James, would you like to add to that?
Just some final words. I came to this conference full of pessimism. I wrote that talk full of pessimism, and I leave this conference full of hope, actually. Why pessimism? Because, like many people, I'm ashamed at my screen time, which every Monday morning pops up on my iPhone. Spend evenings, doom scrolling, nonsense news cycles, nonsense political gossip, wasting my life doing that instead of building the beautiful. Full of pessimism because, as the father of a girl, I'm terrified for her. And the question of pornography, Miriam, thank you for everything you were saying. How on earth am I going to raise a young woman in a world where she's exposed to that? And pessimism because, so I work in the world of think tanks, and so my work is, if I have the privilege sometimes of speaking with government officials or ministers or policymakers, we're so focused on what is expedient and what is achievable. So if we get the ICO to speak to the CMA and the DMU, and if we can just do something a bit better with the Digital Regulators Cooperation Forum and maybe appeal to the number 10 policy unit, that we can maybe push that statutory instrument forward. It's so technocratic, it's so focused on detail, perhaps necessarily so. It's not a bad thing, but I've also got my own thoughts. So the internet as the architecture of magic, the internet as the forbidden fruit. If I said that kind of stuff, I'd be literally laughed at. I'd lose my job. No one would take me seriously. But today, let me just finish this thought. It isn't a bad thing. It would require bravery on my part and on the part of people in government. But today I'm
Babs?
listening to people
Hey, it's me.
that I respect, people who are influential,
Great, thank you.
using that language, taking these ideas seriously. There's a former Secretary of State in this room. There is the former head of the number 10 policy unit in this room. There are people extremely influential in American politics in this room, listening to talks, spending their weekends listening to talks about magic and the Garden of Eden. That fills me full of hope. And what I said about the new Mont Pelerin or the new Bretton Woods, the need to build an institution here and now, is if we have a former Secretary of State and a policymaker and influential people and journalists and editors, each one of those people are bricks in the wall, and that brick in the wall just gets taken out little by little. And there are young people in this room as well, you and you and you. You ask questions, you get it. So, in conclusion, you're very lucky that I'm full of hope, not pessimism, because otherwise in conclusion, yes, there's a fight ahead. It's going to be a hell of a fight. There's every chance we might lose it, because we're fighting some vested interests which are very powerful. And yes, the Rubicon might have been crossed. But I don't know, there's something about the people in this room, the here, the now, the ideas being shared, and the influence of the people who are present that makes me leave Cambridge tomorrow morning full of hope and ambition.
Thank you all again.